markers. Awesome, awesome. Okay, people come in as we're kind of doing this, but thank you all so much for joining us today. I am super excited for the second iteration of our Green Goods Masterclass. We created this masterclass to really fill in some of these educational gaps that all of us have can relate to. The current statistics said there's about 13% of medical schools that teach formally about cannabis. I think that's a gross overestimation, just kind of from my interaction with providers across the country. So thank you all so much for joining us. Again, we started this masterclass to fill in the gaps, but we're going to be doing them leading up to our provider conference in our home state of Minnesota, which will be April 7th, followed by a Grow Tour April 8th. Really excited to pair with the Medical Resource Association. We're going to be providing all of the healthcare providers there with free CME credits based on medical cannabis. So we'll really be able, again, to fill in those gaps. So super excited about that. And again, please use the chat function. Please use the Q&A function throughout this evening, and we will get to all of your questions. So without further ado, let's get it started in here. Again, my name is Paloma Layfelt. I am the Senior Director of Clinical Science and Partnerships at Goodness Growth Holdings. We're a physician-led and physician-founded cannabis company based in Minnesota. I'm also a physician, and like most of the providers joining us here today, I did not receive any formal education about cannabis, which is completely unfortunate. I am joined today, we'll give them the due diligence of their amazing bios, but by two true cannabis scientists, which is incredibly rare. Two PhDs, I call them cannabis science titans. I was actually on their podcast, Smoke and Science, that's the letter N, a couple months ago, and we discussed, I actually read from my medical school textbook for Step 1 USMLE, kind of exactly what it was that I actually was taught about cannabis. And it was in the same section as other drugs of abuse, which is a complete disservice to people across the country and the world. This is a plant we've co-evolved with for thousands and thousands of years. So today, the goal is really to hopefully fill in some of these knowledge gaps on our endogenous endocannabinoid system, as well as flower, exogenous cannabinoids, and beyond. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Riley Kirk, PhD. She is a natural product chemist with a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences. Her research interests have broadly focused on the use of medicinal plants and combating antibiotic resistance and alternative pain treatments to opiates. Her current research at Real Isolates focuses on characterizing the transformation and rearrangement of cannabis secondary metabolites during the smoking process and how we can better predict what pharmacological effects this leads to. Dr. Kirk is passionate about providing free and accessible cannabis education to all users, mainly through social media channels. More education will facilitate safer consumption methods, laboratory testing, and transparency. Dr. Kirk, we are so happy to have you join us this evening. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much, Paloma, and the rest of the Goodness Growth Holdings team. I really appreciate you guys putting on this webinar, and I'm so glad it's free for everyone to join, and we can all talk about these important subjects together.
Love it. We will make sure to drop both Dr. Riley and Dr. Shields' social media channels in the chat. Truly, you know, as far as cannabis science goes, we have the two top experts here. And Dr. Shields, who I'll be introducing now, makes me not abhor organic chemistry as much as I once did. Dr. Miyabi Shields, PhD, is a pharmaceutical scientist who specializes in endocannabinoid system, drug discovery, and is the co-founder of Real Isolates, a cannabis research company and co-inventor of cannabis smoke extract, which we'll definitely talk about today. The team at Real Isolates aims to recreate the unique profile patients prefer from smoking cannabis flower into edible, topical, and other formulations. Miyabi's research began in 2010, the same year they received their prescription for medical cannabis. From 2010 to 2012, they evaluated drugs that act downstream of the ECS in animal models at the University of California, Davis. From 2012 to 2018, they completed their PhD at Northeastern University, investigating the structural biochemistry of ECS targets. Since then, Dr. Shields has focused on the phytocannabinoids with a special interest in rare cannabinoid formulations, especially in cannabis smoke. Welcome to this evening. I guess it's not evening everywhere from our West Coasters. Welcome here, Dr. Shields. What a pleasure to have you. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. Very passionate about flower and the endocannabinoid system.
And I mean, how rare is it? I mean, every time I read your bio, it's kind of, jaw drop that this has been going on, that you've been studying cannabis with formal education for so long. So I'm going to start first. We'll address this for both of you because this is one of my favorite questions to ask everybody. But Riley, why cannabis?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I am a natural product chemist. So during my time in graduate school, I studied hundreds of different plants and the way that those plants, metabolites, can interact with the human body and what therapeutic potential they may have for us. And throughout all the plants that I studied, nothing compares to the potential of cannabis, in my opinion. And that's really due to the endocannabinoid system and the way that the endocannabinoid system is involved and intertwined with every other system in our body, which essentially has limitless therapeutic potential. And even if our bodies are dysregulated in different ways, cannabis can still provide benefits for so many people. It's also incredibly understudied, and I am a cannabis user, but I'm a recreational user. I'm not a medicinal user. And I think there's a huge stigma behind cannabis use, specifically in professions like STEM professions. And cannabis is one of the reasons I got through graduate school and I was able to maintain my mental health during graduate school. So I'm very thankful for the plant, and it's really benefited my life in a lot of ways. And I want to help get the scientific information to as many people as possible so we can all appreciate the plant and also appreciate the science behind the plant.
Absolutely. And I totally appreciate your candor in really, saying that this has helped me personally. And that really aids, as a PhD scientist in combating the stigma. So thank you for that. Dr. Shields, same question for you. Why cannabis?
So I think that the honest answer here is that cannabis saved my life. And I know when I say that, it seems like a hyperbole or something that is just a very cliched statement. But I really mean it. And I'm a medical user. One of the things that makes working with Riley so great is that we have very similar ideas about pharmaceutical sciences, drug discovery. We come from these ideas from kind of different life experiences and opposite sides of science. So Riley studied natural products chemistry as a pharmaceutical scientist, and I studied the endocannabinoid system. My entire career and passion was built upon understanding why cannabis helps me when other medications don't. And it's not to say that it's for everyone or that other medications are for everyone. But the reality is that there are plenty of different people out there who respond differently to cannabis and to pharmaceuticals. And there's a place for both plants and pills. And studying cannabis, similar to the sentiment Riley said, studying cannabis really was attractive to me because I had the need to understand myself. And then afterwards, it was just a natural tangent to understand, to help other people understand, because once you start learning about the plant and the endocannabinoid system and the way that the endocannabinoid system works in the body, once you gain that understanding and you gain the understanding of just how safe cannabis can be when it's used in a responsible way, and when there's education around it, there really is, it opens the door to a lot of opportunity for people who currently don't have any treatments or any options. And so, that's just why I'm here.
Yeah, I love that. And both of you are saying, very similar things in different ways. And just the fact that I think Riley said that, the endocannabinoid system literally interacts with almost every other organ system in our bodies. So we call it almost a pharmacological treasure trove, and it's really doing a disservice that we don't have these treatment modalities, or we don't have the research backing these treatment modalities, which is why we need Dr. Shields and Dr. Kirk here. I'm going to stay with Miyabi for a minute, and since this is the topic of today's masterclass, What is cannabis flower and how does it differ from other forms of delivery?
So the flower is what it sounds like. It's the flowering portion of the plant. And the way that I've described this to other people, like, did you know that kale and broccoli come from the same evolutionary plant? It's a brassica plant. We developed and cultivated broccoli for the flower, and when you eat broccoli, you're eating the flower. And we developed kale for the leaves. But they come from the same like parent. And in a similar way, the cannabis flower, we have cultivated medical cannabis for the flower. In this case, not to eat it, but to produce molecules inside the flower that interact with our systems and cause beneficial effects. So when we're talking about what is cannabis flower, it is actually the reproductive portion of a plant. And I think that that's magical. And before I go off on like a really long tangent on how and why that's so magical that a plant and that life would create something like this, you know, when we talk about flower, usually the most common form that we're talking about is smoking flower. That's the most common thing. The other thing you can do with flower, though, is you can either dry herb vape it, which is a low temperature heating, or you can extract it. So I think I'll turn it over to Riley to talk about the difference in between inhaling versus extracting and having edible formulations, both of which can originally come from flower, but have very different effects profiles in terms of like time for onset and kinetics.
Yeah, so time of onset is a really big part when we're talking about smoking or vaping. A lot of people, specifically medical users of cannabis, they might have a sort of flare up, or if they have migraines, something that hits them kind of quickly. And they need to be able to help those symptoms as quickly as possible. So in this case, an edible could take up to 2 hours to feel the benefits of that. But with flower, when you're smoking or vaping, it's going directly from your lungs into your brain, essentially. And that's essentially instant, and that can be extremely beneficial when we think of those conditions that we need to help as early as possible. And then with edibles, it's different. So when we eat an edible, it's going to go in our body and it's going to get metabolized in our liver. And THC, the psychoactive compound in cannabis, it gets metabolized in your liver and it gets changed a bit through that metabolism and turns into a different metabolite called 11-hydroxy THC. 11-hydroxy THC, which you'll feel if you've ever taken an edible, can feel a little bit stronger than normal THC if you were smoking it. And this is because this molecule actually does bind to the receptor in your brain responsible for the psychoactive effects of cannabis, the CB1 receptor. It binds a little bit stronger, and we have some data saying that it also goes through your blood-brain barrier faster. So although the effects are very similar, they are also different enough that a lot of people also don't like the effects of edibles and can feel very overwhelmed. They can feel couch locked sometimes, whereas normally smoking wouldn't provide that effect. So there's huge differences there. So when you're inhaling, it's much more instant. And then when you take a edible, it takes much longer. But also, if you were to be making edibles, as Miyabi said, you are going to be extracting that flower. So you're going to be removing the bioactive compounds from that flower and putting it into something like an oil or an alcohol that you can then cook with. Or you could make topical products or other products with it. And topicals aren't going to make you like feel high, but they can provide some local effects because you can actually control where you're putting it. So it can provide some local effects that cannabinoids can provide, like reducing inflammation, or it specifically helps with like eczema, psoriasis, those kind of inflammatory skin conditions, or even things like arthritis at specific locations. Miyabi, I don't know if you want to keep going off of that.
One thing I just wanted to add about this, about flower, and in terms of like topicals, like Riley's describing, like extracting from flower, this is different than like a CBD lotion or a lotion that you would get that is made from isolates. And the reason why it's different is because usually if you're making it at home or if you're extracting it from the flower, you're taking, as Riley said, all of the bioactive molecules or as many out of the plant as you can. And it's a very different profile than if you're using an isolate because there are hundreds of molecules in the plant. And so one other way that flower differs from some of these other products, especially edibles made with distillate, which really quickly I'll just define what distillate is in case people aren't familiar. Many of the edibles made in the market now are made with something called cannabis distillate, which means that you extract the flower or the biomass, you get the active molecules, and then you distill it in a way that's very similar to like alcohol. So like in the difference between like a wine and brandy, or the difference between like a beer or wine and a hard form of alcohol, distilled cannabis distillate is just the cannabinoids. It's concentrated cannabinoids. And edible products that are made with distillate contain mostly just the active cannabinoids without other compounds from the plant. And the flower has hundreds of compounds. So that's another major difference. Riley and I talk about it all the time. It's a term called chemodiversity, and it describes the number of different molecules that are present. And the flower, the plant, contains a huge amount of chemodiversity. And it's not necessarily a bad thing for there to be hundreds of different molecules. For many people, it's a good thing, and it leads to beneficial effects.
And can I just also add on, like, this is part of the reason why the cannabis research, although we have a ton of cannabis research, it is very difficult to evaluate how 200 different compounds that are acting on different receptors at different affinities and in different ratios affect different people in different ways. So although we keep saying we need more research, we do, and we also need more tools that can evaluate something of this complexity, because the traditional pharmaceutical route is, okay, ligand or molecule of choice and receptor of choice, let's see how they stick together, and then we say, okay, what can this be used for as a drug, XYZ. It's not usually these complex extracts that we don't even know some of the compounds that exist, and we don't even know how those compounds could act on our body. So it is part of the reason why cannabis research is, we do have a lot of it, but we still need more, and we will continue to generate that data for decades.
We certainly do not have enough of it. I think everybody can agree on that. And, really appreciate both of you breaking it down. Cannabis medicine can be completely overwhelming, even for people that have been studying it for years. Our chief medical officer, Dr. Stephen Dahmer, as you guys both have, reiterated, calls the cannabis plant the plant of 1,001 different medicines. There's no other, and please name, if you can, another single agent pharmaceutical that really has the potential to aid in symptomatology associated with PTSD, anxiety, chronic pain, multiple sclerosis. There's none, just because there's so many different combinations of terpenes, cannabinoids, and dosage forms. And I want to bring it back to flower a little bit. I know Dr. Kirk mentioned a little bit on some populations that flower and inhalation methods would be great for people that need that fast onset time. But I'm going to kick it back to you, actually, Dr. Kirk. And are there any other individuals or patient groups that would really benefit from flower in particular?
Yeah, and of course, this is just my opinion, and I'm going to let Miyabi speak on their perspective of this also. But I also think that people who've previously struggled with substance abuse disorders, where, if you have a very addictive personality, that may be using flower, which specifically if you have some sort of like ritualistic aspect of it that takes time, such as grinding your weed and then rolling it up in a joint and then smoking that takes a long time, and it's like something you have to think about for a while. Whereas they make these pens now, like cartridges of cannabis distillate or concentrate. Those are really easy to just hit all the time. People tell me all the time they keep it next to their bed, or they're driving with it and they hit it 30 times in a row, and if that's something that you have if you struggle controlling the amount that you're using, I think flower is a good place to kind of understand just how to use in moderation and how to really ease into it without overdoing it. Of course, this is not a a rule that's for everyone, but I found it has helped people in the past who have struggled with that.
Love that as a harm reduction method.
Exactly, yeah.
And same question to you, Miyavi.
Yeah, so I want to second up on the concentrates being potentially easy to develop tolerance to, as opposed to flower, because concentrates for the most part are mainly THC. There are or CBD, but concentrates are a concentrated version of the plant, and they don't contain all of those other molecules, and so they end up like uniformly affecting your brain. When you create tolerance, tolerance also for people who are not aware. Tolerance is what happens when you need more and more of the same thing. So you would need more and more cannabis to get the same effect. And it develops when your receptors or your brain are recycled in a way such that they're like tired, like you're activating them too regularly with the same exact thing. And because flower is different, and every flower is different for that matter, it's easier to moderate. It's easier to not develop tolerance so rapidly. This is just also personal opinion and personal experience, but I developed tolerance to those concentrate pens very quickly. And this is just an N equals 1 of me, but I developed tolerance to the pens much faster, which means that I need more and more. Like I would need to take 2 puffs on the pen instead of just 1. And it happens much faster than it does with flower. And the other population that I was going to talk about as people that where flower might be good for, besides like fast acting, people who need fast acting relief, is for people who have very complex and overlapping disorders. There's an intersectionality with some of these disorders that you were mentioning earlier, Paloma. You said, there's nothing like cannabis where it can help so many things, like what Dr. Stephen Dahmer was saying, the 1,001 applications, and that has to do with the endocannabinoid system and just how ingrained the endocannabinoid system is in all of our processes. But it also has to do with how complex the flower is. So for some people, like I said earlier, I'm a medical patient. I suffer from chronic pain, mental health, and GI issues, and they all overlap in each other in the mechanism of how they work. For people who have these overlapping disorders, flower can be really, really beneficial because it's so different that there's certain flowers that you're sensitive to, maybe it doesn't work for you, but then there are flowers that work exceptionally well for very specific reasons. And it's a lot of trial and error, but I would say that I think that that's why a lot of chronic illness patients do gravitate towards full spectrum or flower type products, because you can experience types of relief that you would not experience from distillate or isolate products.
Love it. Here's a secret. The only reason that I really had you guys on this podcast is so I can learn more about cannabis medicine. Dropping knowledge. Thank you guys. And I want to switch gears a little bit and switch it back to Riley, who is a chemist and a cannabis expert. So as a chemist, can you talk a little bit more? We've talked about it a bit, but about cannabinoid profiles in flower, what makes it so unique?
Yeah, so I also just want to mention for anyone in the audience who isn't aware, the picture that's on the slide here of the little like bubbly looking things, that's called a trichome, and it's on the bud of the flower. And those are like little machines that produce cannabinoids and terpenes like very, very efficiently. And that's why we're using the bud of the flower, because it's so abundant and these little trichomes that are making all of these compounds. But when you're looking at flower and cannabinoid profiles, most of the profiles are dominant in 1 to 2 cannabinoids. Usually the ones that sell the best at dispensaries are very high THC percentage flower, and that's just because THC flower dominates just what people think they're getting the most bang for their buck out of. But a lot of people don't react well to flower that's extremely high in THC and doesn't have any of the other cannabinoids present, specifically CBD. So this is something we call a balanced profile, when it has both CBD and THC, or if it had CBG and CBD, or just more than one thing, is usually considered a balanced profile, and usually makes people feel a little less anxious and has less of the the very overwhelming effects that a high THC flower can provide, which a lot of people are uncomfortable, including me. I really don't like high percent THC flower. But I think it's important to note that you can purchase high THC flower, and if your body doesn't react well with it, you're not liking how that feels, you can also legally purchase hemp flower in pretty much every state. And these are high, you can buy flower that's high in CBD and has little to no THC because it legally has to be below 0.3% THC. So you could have CBD flower, dominant flower at home. You could have CBG dominant flower at home. You could have THC dominant flower at home. And if you couldn't find a one-to-one strain of what you wanted, you can create that by adding different flowers together and making essentially a strain of your own by combining them, and then whatever works best for your body. And that could be totally like mood or day or time dependent too. Maybe at nighttime you prefer a more dominant THC, but in the morning you don't want a lot of THC. You have to go to work. So maybe you want just a tiny bit of THC to help with that pain, and then CBD for inflammation. You can create that and curate it to what you need for that time. So I think it's very beneficial to have multiple flowers on hand, because you never know how you're going to feel, and you never know what you're going to want in that moment. And if you have options, then it's amazing. It's kind of empowering too to create the medicine that you want at the time.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I love that idea of personalized medicine. A lot of these chronic conditions that we speak about are multifactorial, meaning that there's many symptoms related to them, and you're not always going to feel the same way every day. Chronic pain is a great example, right? Insomnia, mental health issues associated with it, anorexia. And that's why cannabis is so amazing and diverse, because you can really cater to how you're feeling on a particular day. So thank you for explaining that from a chemistry point of view. Now, going back to Dr. Shields, can we talk about terpenes a little bit? What are terpenes? To start with, what are some of their clinical effects on the body?
So terpenes are just the smelly molecules. When you're thinking about cannabis and you think about the smell, you're thinking about the terpenes. And it's a giant class of molecules that are all produced by the plant from these building blocks that are identical called isoprene. And it creates terpenes. Interestingly, when CBD and THC were first discovered, they were originally classified as a type of terpenoid or a terpene-related compound before they became their own class of cannabinoids. Terpenes are a giant class of molecules. But when you cook in the kitchen and you use herbs like basil or oregano, those are also terpenes that you're smelling. And many of them are similar to the ones that are in cannabis. Like, for example, like pinene is in pine trees. That's why it gets its name from there. Like limonene, which is in citrus fruits, or citronine. Another example would be, I'm trying to just like off the top, geraniol, which is in roses. And or citronella. Many of these other plants create terpenes as well. And it's known that there is an effect on the human body, but it's very complicated. So I love complicated questions. We're just going to get into it. In terms of how it interacts with cannabis, this is still up for debate. There's been a study that was released, I think it was last year, that shows that some of the terpenes have activity at the cannabinoid receptors. Definitely one of them does. Beta-caryophyllene has activity mainly at the CB2 receptor, but this other paper was showing some of the other terpenes, and I think it was an interesting paper. It did show that at high concentrations, terpenes can activate the cannabinoid receptors. It's just not clear to me whether or not there are that many terpenes that are present when you actually are using cannabis flower, because terpenes probably make up between 2 to 5% of the flower at most, and that's really good. That's like a very good quality, high terpene content flower. And they're all different. And terpenes are really volatile, which means that they evaporate easily, and that's why we can smell them. They evaporate easily. So it's not, in my opinion, it's more an effect of the terpenes having involved in other systems in the body, maybe not necessarily directly with the cannabinoid receptors, but through even things like smelling. Like there is a study on smelling rosemary and humans in focus and attentiveness. And that's terpenes. That's the interaction of terpenes, and there's no reason why that wouldn't also contribute to the entourage effect through a different mechanism that's not necessarily cannabinoid receptor related. And I think we're just scratching the surface in understanding how this is happening. There was a paper that was published this year on metabolites of terpenes. So if you were to eat them, like full spectrum edibles that have terpenes within edible formulations, and or like if you were ever to make a tea, which most people wouldn't because it doesn't take the cannabinoids out, teas are usually heavy in terpenes as well. So there's a lot of different small effects of every single terpene. If I were to break down and start talking about each of the individual terpenes, we could be here for a really long time, like linalool, which is like the calming effect. Linalool is also in lavender plants. But actually, hopefully by later this summer, we'll be able to share this. But Riley and I co-authored a chapter where we break down pretty much every terpene and the effects clinically. And there's a lot there. And the answer in a nutshell is that they certainly have an effect, and we do not have any definitive knowledge yet to say exactly which ones do what effect, partially because it's likely to vary from person to person. It's very likely that certain people react well to certain terpenes and other people react poorly because all of our systems are so different, and we have yet to kind of begin to put those things together.
Can I also just add on to that? Because I totally agree with everything you said. And you mentioned that some of the effects might not be receptor mediated, at least not by the cannabinoid receptors, right? But if we think of it, it also could be affecting the way that those compounds get to receptors if they are acting on receptors. So there's a study that mentions that some of the monoterpenes, the smallest terpenes, influence the way other compounds are permeable through the skin. So they increase permeability. So in this way, if the monoterpenes are present, it would assist in the way that other cannabinoids could get to receptors, which is still influencing the way that medicine works. It's just in a way that's not receptor mediated. So it's a little bit abstract to us, but it's still very important and therapeutically relevant.
Oh my God, one more thing, just one more other thing on how they get affected. All right, so concentrate pens that are made with distillate usually don't have terpenes in them, but some concentrate pens like live resin or concentrate pens that have terpenes added back into them do contain terpenes. This will change the viscosity or the thickness of the concentrate in the pen, which changes how that pen hits and changes the dose that you will receive at a certain voltage, because it changes the thickness of the oil that's interacting with the pen. And this is something else that we're barely scratching the surface here, but if you want to see that paper, it was written up by Dr. Amber Wise. Actually, I'm not sure if that part is published yet, but it was presented at, and I think it will be published soon. And it's very interesting because I think it's well known qualitatively in the community that the entourage effect is a thing. And I think in terms of scientists, trying to go back and clinically assess it and get it to be reproducible, we're faced with this giant challenge of human neurodiversity and then the plant's chemodiversity.
Absolutely. And, time flies when you're talking cannabis science because we're already halfway through. Just want to, and I'm following the chat. What an cannabis educated audience. I'm seeing, we're dancing around the entourage effect, but so cool. Thank you guys for engaging. Please, just a quick reminder to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so we can get to some questions at the end. I'm going to ask my favorite question now to both our panelists. I'll ask Miyabi first. What's your favorite terpene or minor cannabinoid and why? I know it's like picking your favorite child, but I'm going to put you on the spot there a little bit with that.
All right, I have an easy answer for this because it doesn't actually have anything to do with the terpene or its effects, and it has everything to do with the fact that geraniol is a precursor piece of CBG or cannabigerol, and I think it is my favorite terpene because when the plant is creating, actually I should be more correct, the plant creates acid versions of all the phytocannabinoids. So the plant will create first CBGA or cannabigerolic acid, And the way that it does this is by taking olivetolic acid, which I feel like I should have brought my set here, but it takes olivetolic acid and it adds a geraniol group to it. So the geraniol terpene, which smells like roses, which I also love. I love roses. The geraniol terpene, which is present in roses and citronella, is actually added on to this olivetolic acid piece, and that's what creates cannabigerolic acid, or CBGA, which is then the precursor for THCA and CBDA. So it's my favorite. It's my favorite terpene because it's like a building block within. So it's like a little inception of the cannabinoids, and I don't know if that's nerdy. It's not. It's also smells good. All right.
Love it. It's our own personal Lego. Same question for you, Riley. Favorite minor cannabinoid or terpene?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say mine would be beta caryophyllene, just because there's some really promising data with the CB2 receptor. And I think that combined with CBD has a lot of potential for people with inflammatory gut conditions. And I think it's very promising. I have friends who use that for IBD and IBS, and they swear by it. So that's just simple answer, but it's my favorite.
Just like to reiterate that we don't actually have favorite terpenes and minor cannabinoids. We appreciate them all for different therapeutic uses. Moving on, I do want to speak a little bit about strains. I think that this is really a number one question that we get at our dispensary. I'm going to talk about them. I think that we've heard of Indica, Sativa, hybrids, but can you speak on that a little bit? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Shields.
Yeah, so there's Indica, Sativa, and hybrid. Like, what are they? They're these different classes of the plant or the molecule. Originally, a while ago, a long time ago, well, actually, really not that long, but let's say over 50 years ago. I'm gonna go pre-prohibition era, even far back then. It probably meant more then to understand what an indica versus a sativa was. Because the plants then were not as diversified as they are now. If you think about the cannabis plant like dogs, and the strains like breeds of dogs, and all of these different breeds of dogs that humans have cultivated for very specific things. In the cannabis plant, it's not like a pug with a flat face versus like a Great Dane who's really tall. In the cannabis plant, we're talking about like terpene profiles, usually size and shape of your nug, like density of the flower. There's one right now, a strain that I'm really interested in called Freak Show, that has these like weird leaves that are very cool looking, and also cannabinoid profile clearly, and effects. And we've been hybridizing, so hybrid meaning breeding these plants together for a really long time now. I mean, so the world's top geneticists have been botanical geneticists have been working in cannabis. In my opinion, there's been an incredible amount of growth and work that has gone into the cannabis plant. But that means that there is genetically, the plant is very inbred. It's very hybridized. And when we talk indica sativa hybrid, we're saying, people usually say indica couch, like you're very tired. It's like a sedating experience. While that could be true, it also could not be true. And sativa, which people say is uplifting and giving you energy, likewise is not always the case, because now we've kind of moved into this space where we know the cannabinoid profiles and the terpene profiles, and it's really that profile that generates the effect more than it is indica, sativa, or a hybrid. But that being said, I still think that they're really important. I'll let Riley talk about this piece because we talk about it all the time. I think understanding indica, sativa, and hybrid and what they are is still important for consumers, because it's overwhelming when you're trying to educate about flower.
Yeah, exactly. I'll take that from there. But essentially, a lot of people now are trying to get away from this indica sativa hybrid nomenclature and move towards words like chemical variety or chemovar, cultivation variety or cultivar, which are absolutely more accurate terms, but most of the world is still brand new to cannabis. And if we start introducing words before they're even used to the last words, it's not a good way to feel inclusive in the cannabis space. So I still love the words indica, sativa, and hybrid, or specifically indica, sativa, to describe the feeling. I think what we need is a way to leverage this to document how people are feeling from indica or sativa flowers. And then if we can start to like build data around that, we can start to understand what chemical ratios, what chemicals are present and absent in strains that are sativas and which ones in indicas. And if we can get that for a huge population, we'll start to understand how these different ratios have different physiological effects and how different cohorts of people react differently to these different strains of cannabis, to actually help understand how we can use this therapeutically and how we can index beforehand how we think someone's going to react based on their medical conditions or even maybe their genetics someday. But I think the indica sativa is a good stepping stone, and it's a good way for bud tenders to communicate with the public very easily. If they're looking for something to help them sleep, just suggesting an indica is a lot easier than going down well, do you know what a chemovar is? If we had that education, it's great, but we don't right now, especially free education. So once we have those free educational resources for people to access at home ahead of time before going to the dispensary, then that's when I think we could start implementing that. But right now, let's just try talking to people in the language that they might understand, like indica sativa.
Thank you for breaking that down in an incredibly accessible way. Cannabis genetics is an incredibly polarizing topic. I think we all know that. So thank you for that. I'm loving everyone's favorite terpenes in the chat. Keep it up. We're following it. Next question. One of the main reasons we're doing this educational series, and I can't reiterate how important it is what Dr. Kirk keeps saying about accessibility to free education and how important it is. I couldn't agree with you more on that. One of the reasons we're doing this masterclass in particular, again, the lack of education, the lack of formal knowledge that we all really have experienced throughout our careers. When it comes to flower, I think flower can be incredibly intimidating for healthcare providers, and states are really just opening up flower in some regions. In New York specifically, flower just became available in the past few months. In Minnesota, where we're based, is going to start making flower available to the patients on March 1st of this year. So super excited to have that method available to everyone as we truly believe it should be. But I'm going to ask Dr. Kirk first. Can you give some words of wisdom or share some resources that might help guide these clinicians that have never seen flower before so that it can better serve their patients?
Sure. I think for some people that might react well to flower, and something that you could suggest for them is trial and error. As Miyabi was kind of describing before, all these different plants have different profiles, and one might work really well for you and one might not. So buying a really small quantity of flower and trying it out, and always starting with a very small amount of product, specifically if it's high THC. You never want to overwhelm someone who's new to cannabis. You want to be able to feel those effects and see if you can actually document how it feels. Making sure you're writing down what that flower was, asking patients to write in a journal that they went to this dispensary, they purchased this flower, it was X percent THC, X percent CBD, it was high in this terpene, they took it at 8:45 a.m. after a full meal, just recording everything they can, both about the flower, about their experience, about their mood, about everything in that situation. And then the patient's going to learn a lot about themselves and how that flower reacts with them. You're going to learn more about that patient. And obviously being very open, like encouraging your patients to be open with you about their cannabis use and not being judgmental, which I'm not saying you guys are, I'm just saying it's very helpful when physicians are very open. If you even ask to see their notebook, that might be something, if they're willing to share, obviously. That would be really special, I'm sure, to them, to feel appreciated and to feel like the effort they're going through to try to help with their therapeutic journey is also appreciated by you. And just talking with them through it, I think, is going to be very beneficial. And another thing that I think is really special about flower is, and we've kind of touched upon this too, but the natural ratio that the plant makes these compounds in is not something to be ignored. The plant can only enzymatically produce a certain percent of cannabinoids in that flower. It can't go beyond that threshold. It just doesn't have the genetic capability to. And when we're seeing like these new diseases emerging, like cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome and something like that, the flower, it seems to be caused by people using really high amounts of THC, specifically in concentrates. And with the flower, because it has a threshold of how much THC it can produce, and it's going to be producing other compounds that likely help in the prevention of that, because not many people get CHS from flower. It can also be helpful for that as well. And Miyabi, I'm not sure if you want to add on there, but
oh my gosh, preach. I think that was a really great summation of why we should be actually, like, flower is a great place in many ways as an introduction because it is gentle in that way and controllable, and that in terms of like the trial and error and keeping a journal, the best journal is one that you're actually going to keep. So record as much data as you are going to actually keep. Like, I personally have a really high threshold for writing down statistics. Like, I track a lot of things that and then eventually you can get to a point, like, I pretty much always have on me, I'll disclose, like, my ratio, like one of my best chosen ratios, I guess, is that I have 40% high CBG hemp flower, 40% high CBD hemp flower, and then 20%, I guess it's a high THC flower, but I never really use anything that's higher than about 10%, like 10 or 13% THC. And I mix that up into a salad, and that is my personal go-to. And I found that through like trial and error and writing it down and the cannabinoid profiles. And the best way to know that is to actually write it down. And the best journal that you're going to have, and the best way to do that, is one that you keep over time, because it took me like a couple years to get to the point. And, along the way of those years, I was learning more and more as I went, and things got better. That's how trial and error works. But it did take me a while to get to the point where, like, you can pinpoint the things that work for you. And so the best journal is one that you're going to keep. I think people really, journaling is, you can say, like, I can't say enough about how beneficial it is for cannabis patients, and when they're trying to track their symptoms, and how helpful it could be if you were able to share it with your provider. I think that would be incredible. So the open-mindedness, I'll second that. And then a third thing that has not nothing, but it's not specific to flower, and it's specific to the endocannabinoid system. I would really encourage physicians, if they haven't heard of clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, to please go check out. It's called clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. It's a theory coined by Dr. Ethan Russo. I want to say that it's a theory, but I also want to remind everyone that scientists still call gravity and evolution a theory. So it's a theory, but there's a lot of evidence that many of us have lower levels of circulating endocannabinoids, and that circulating endocannabinoids, when they are depressed, when there are lower levels of circulating endocannabinoids, this can cause symptoms that range from chronic pain to mental health to GI issues, or all three, and that it's very, very closely linked to a few different chronic illnesses. And this is just, I think if you haven't heard of this, it's something that's really useful, because patients who come in with symptoms that line up, that potentially could benefit from this, because cannabis will restore the balance if someone has lower levels of circulating endocannabinoids. And it's something that is relatively easy to try and non-toxic.
Thank you for bringing up clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. We just dropped a link there so you can learn more about it. As we start to wrap up, we're going to take some questions from the audience. But before we do that, for our clinicians out there, I just want to ask both of you how, because, again, we don't have this education, but what are the different ways that patients, consumers can actually consume cannabis flower specifically? Dr. Shields, we'll start with you since you're off mute.
Oh, sorry. Wait, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, of course, of course. What are just some ways that you can consume flower, that people can consume it?
Right. Okay. So I mentioned way earlier, but the most common way to consume flower is to smoke it. And there are many different ways to smoke it. So even though we consider smoking one, and I won't go too deep into this because this is our research topic as well, but even though we consider smoking to be an umbrella term, smoking flower, there are many different ways to smoke flower. You can smoke flower in a bowl or a pipe or a piece, which would just be like putting the flower into like usually some sort of glass, or sometimes it's made out of metal or ceramic, but I prefer glass, some sort of glass bowl, and then you apply heat either through a lighter, or sometimes people use little wicks like a hemp wick, and that's the first way. The other way could be a bong or a bubbler. Those two have filtration. It's water filtration. Both of them also have a form of concentration, which means that like if you imagine a bong is usually it looks like a long vase, and the smoke enters into the neck before you inhale it, and it concentrates it so you get a larger dose at all at the same time. There's joints, which are like rolled in paper, and it's flower rolled in paper. There are blunts, which are rolled in tobacco leaf, or I've actually seen them more recently also rolled in hemp leaf and in rose petals. I have also seen that. And these are all very different ways that you can use flower, and they are all actually different in terms of the chemical profile that you end up ingesting. They're this pharmacology of how smoke is different is complicated, but that's one of the reasons why flower is incredible, because all of these different small changes that you can make in temperature, in time, in method can give you a very different effect. And then the other way is by dry herb vapes, which is you buy a vaporizer and it goes to a relatively low temperature, and will take usually just the THC or the CBD off the flower, and you're left with like a light brown. The flower is like light brown when you're done, or dark brown, depending on the temperature. And you can actually use that immediately in an edible if you want to. It's called like already been vaped, or ABV flower, and you can dry or vape the flower, and then after the flower has been vaped, you can actually put that directly just in something. Like I used to put it in chili because it tastes great with chili. And that's just one of the other ways. And then the third way would be to extract it, but that's a more advanced technique to create edibles or topicals, something else.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this is a question from the audience that kind of ties into some of the research that you both are doing. This question is for both of you. What's unique about smoking flower?
Do you want to take it, Riley, or do you want me to start?
You're doing great. You can just keep going.
All right. So I see here, there's a comment from W. Young saying combustion is bad, dry or vapor is the way to go. We can all agree that there's been a lot of research on combustion, and that there are things that are created in smoke, like smoke particulates, that are not beneficial and that have been linked to potentially negative effects. I don't believe that anyone is going to argue with that. However, there's also a huge landscape of research that has yet to be done on the complex formulations that are present when you apply heat. And most natural products, in terms of traditional medicine, if we're talking about ethnopharmacology and the historical use of these plants, are what's called a crude extract, which is a really complicated way of just saying that it is straight from the plant. And smoke is a crude extract, which means that it comes straight from the plant and is incredibly complex. So the things that are unique about it is that every single time that you smoke, depending on the humidity of the air outside, the moisture content of the actual flower, it will change slightly, and it will change like the actual formulation that you take in. And for some people, it's possible that has a benefit that isn't present in edibles, and for example, edible formations. And then the other piece of it that I'll just touch on is there's 20% of people can't actually feel edibles. They are incapable of, it's possibly metabolism or absorption, but they actually can't feel edibles. And then there's another percentage of people who can feel edibles, but too much. I would fall under that category, and are very, very sensitive to the metabolite Riley was talking about, which is 11-hydroxy. And so I think that would be a summation of just a summary of what is really, really unique about cannabis flower and about high temperatures or smoking flower.
Thank you for that. I have another question from the audience for Dr. Kirk from Shelley Beckman. Dr. Riley, you mentioned CBD is everywhere. It is good to mix with THC. I typically tell my patients to stay away from CBD shops in the strip mall or the random shop on the corner of the street, as I feel we don't know the safety of these products. Am I incorrect on my thoughts on this? Do you feel most of these are safe? I find many of my patients say they get terrible headaches from these places. Preach.
Yeah, that is true. And some of those products are also pretty old, which you don't necessarily want to use that either. So I would agree with you to not recommend gas station CBD, which is kind of what we refer to it as a whole, just like kind of random CBD from a gas station corner store. If you live in a state which almost all states have hemp available, you can do research, find out if you have a farm near you, and then, you might have an organic farm near you as well, but also hemp is legal, so you can buy it online too. So you could do research on just some reputable farms that have, thousands of Google reviews saying that this is a really high quality product. They use really high quality soils and plants, and they package well and all that stuff. And then you can just recommend that. It doesn't need to be something right down the road because it is legal. You can buy it online. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for that. That is a common question we get, and unfortunately, we're almost at time right now. We have a couple more questions, but we'll drop how to follow and get in touch with Dr. Kirk and Dr. Shields. If they're feeling generous, they might answer these questions on their social media channels. Really just want to thank both of you for joining us today. This went by so fast, and thank you to our attendees for staying with us through this amazing educational series. We've been following your chat the whole time. I'll go to both of you if you have final thoughts, want to wrap, and how they can find you. I'll start with Dr. Kirk.
I just want to say specifically to all the MDs present who see patients, it means a lot that you're attending this event and that you're listening to what we have to say, and hopefully it's translatable to the patients that you help, because a lot of people want to use cannabis as medicine, but they don't have someone to talk to about it. They don't have someone to share resources about cannabis. And I think that you are the people that people turn to for advice on their health. And the fact that you're here, you're open about it, and you want to help your patients means a lot to me, and I'm sure to many people here. So just thank you for attending, and thank you to all the other people attending who aren't MDs. As always, mad love.
Dr. Shields.
Yeah, thank you so much also, Dr. Paloma, for having us and for thinking about us to talk about advantages and disadvantages of flower, because I think it's a topic that is complicated and it's a gray area topic. There's a lot of black and white thinking in the world. There's a lot of binaries in society. Like, the human brain really gravitates towards wanting a yes or a no answer, a 1 or a 2, an inside or an out. It's natural. It's natural for the human brain, and so therefore for society, to want to see things in a binary. But the reality is not, and flower is an area of gray. So I really appreciate it, and I have loved being here and talking with everyone. And I feel the same as Riley. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out and listening to us chat about flower, and for asking great questions and throwing them in the chat. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. And we'll be following up with all of our attendees. For those of you that are providers in Minnesota, I'm going to drop the landing page to our provider conference. That will be in April. Would love to see you guys there for CME credits on cannabis specifically. Again, thank you so much to our amazing esteemed panelists. We'll tell you how to follow them. We'll tell you how to learn more about the research that they're doing. Thank you to the Goodness Growth Communications and Medical Education team, and for Medical Resource Association. Hope you have an amazing, amazing night. use your flower and your newfound education responsibly, and we will all see each other hopefully very soon. Thank you guys so much.